carry on. That's it, right, okay. So my name's Louise Crosby and I'm accompanied by Carol Dillon. We've been appointed by the Secretary of State as the examining inspectors for the Shropshire Local Plan. I think looking at the participants list, we've met a lot of you in previous sessions. As you know, we've had to revert to the virtual format at short notice, and thanks to the council and Kerry and Ian, we've managed to get through most of the sessions fairly well. I know there's been some problems this morning getting people from Matter 8 joined up, but hopefully those teething problems are now out of the way. Hopefully you've all had a chance to digest the revised guidance note that's been published to cover the virtual event. And I think probably a lot of you have taken part in either these virtual events or other ones in the last couple of years. The key things for today are that all your electronic devices are set to silent and that cameras are switched off unless you're being addressed by me or you've been invited to speak. If you have problems with connectivity, if you can try and rejoin using the link provided in the invite. Other options might be to restart your device, and if after all that fails, if you can speak to the programme officer. The session is being recorded and live streamed. If you wish to raise a question, if you use the hands up function, I'll come to you in turn. There'll be no cross-examination of participants, and it won't be permissible to respond back to a point unless I invite you to do so. When it comes to your turn, if you can speak up, particularly so that the recording can hear you as well as us. You should all have the agenda for this afternoon's session, which is Matter 8. So what I'll normally do is address the council's representations first, and then I'll give them an opportunity to comment on participants' comments too. We'll make sure everybody has their opportunity to say what they want to say. I'll turn to the agenda in a moment and explain how we're going to go through it this afternoon. But we'll take a break round about 3 o'clock, and it's not clear at the moment whether we'll get through the whole of this session today. It's been very difficult to predict. We have got quite a large number of people taking part today, so we will review the situation later in the day when we see where we're up to. So that we can begin promptly after the break, if you can just stay in the Teams call and just turn off your camera and your mic. If anybody's unhappy about the session as it unfolds, can you shout up and let me know, or let the programme officer know? So turning to the council, if you can just introduce yourself for this afternoon's session. I think I've seen a few of you before, but I think we've got some new faces there as well. And then I'll explain how the agenda is going to work this afternoon.
Okay, thank you, Inspector Crosby. It's Eddie West, I'm the Local Plans Manager at Shropshire Council.
I'm Daniel Corbin, one of the principals at Shropshire Council, with specific focus on housing.
Matthew Jones, a policy officer at Shropshire Council. And Simon Drummond-Hay from HDH Planning and Development, and we were authors of the Viability study.
Thank you.
And Hugh Richards, Planning Barrister advising the Council.
Thank you. I'll just shut my window just as I've started. There's a lot of noise outside, so just bear with me a second.
If I may, Inspector Crosby, if I may just raise a point, if it's appropriate to do so now, or whether you just wanted to finish your introduction.
No, if I've finished, I'll just come to the agenda in a minute. So if you want to say something, Mr. West, that's fine.
Thank you, Inspector Crosby. It was just a question really about the agenda today. You've already mentioned that there's some uncertainty whether we'll get through the agenda today. As you've already seen, we've got a consultant here today who's not available later this week, specifically to talk about points 14 to 19 on the agenda, or that's where the contribution will be most useful, I think, on that point, hopefully. So it was just in relation to Mr. Drummond-Hay not being available tomorrow. I wonder whether there was any need to think about rejigging the agenda at all if you don't think we're going to get through it today, but I just want to set that out there, just sort of.
Yeah, there's been a few people asked Kerry this morning, and I've sort of, Ms Dillon's been dealing with the matter this morning. I've been corresponding with Kerry on various matters on matter 8 because of the complexity of the timings and things. I have told people we would deal with infrastructure first, so I think there's quite a lot of people here for that. What we could do is monitoring and implementation. I haven't got a lot to say on that, and I don't think from memory a lot of people have comments on that, so we can take that last, and it might be that we just take that as read. In terms of the infrastructure, what I was planning to do to save a little bit of time, and because I think a lot of people here, say around the virtual table, there are comments cover a range of matters on infrastructure, but are based on particular areas. Can I just check if the council have disappeared or if they're still there? Sorry, I didn't know whether we'd lost. So I didn't know whether we'd lost connection. So yeah, what I was proposing to do with infrastructure was to take questions 1 to 7 all together. And that allows me maybe to that people can condense all their comments together on infrastructure. And what I will do, once I've heard from the council, I'll hear from everybody once, a bit like we did with some of the matters last week that were we had quite a lot of people. So people will have the say on questions 1 to 7, and then we'll move to the next person. And where I think it's probably necessary, I'll bring the council in. So that might foreshorten it a little bit. Do you have
sounds
any?
like a very sensible approach.
Yeah. Okay. So we won't waste any more time. We'll just get on with it. And do the council want to say anything on those points 1 to 7, or do you want me to just bring people in and then comment?
I think it would appear that a lot of the questions on the agenda do relate to what's in our matters statement in any case. So in order to use sufficient examination time efficiently, I don't think that there's anything we want to say specifically at this point, but obviously we would seek to come in as and when required. If you're happy with that.
That's fine, yeah, and I've got a few questions, but I'll pick them up at the end if they've not already been covered. I think that's probably the best way of making the best use of this afternoon. Okay. So if I turn now, so if everybody puts their hand up if they want to speak on questions 1 to 7, you'll be given one opportunity to speak on that range of questions, and I'll bring you in turn. So top of the list is Mr. Cully.
Thank you, Ma'am. It's not related to the to questions 1 to 7. It's really in relation to the point that you'd made about the kind of the ordering of the agenda for this afternoon, and the way in which it intended to deal with the monitoring and implementation issue. So you're probably aware that the Black Country's kind of main interest in this matter is around the monitoring and the development plan review issue specifically. I know that we've discussed this or touched on this a number of times at the previous sessions, the DTC session being the main one. So if you don't intend to kind of discuss this any further in relation to this matter, then that would be helpful to understand, given the pressures of the examination time, if you take our statement as read effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to discuss it either if we've got time today or if people want to be heard on it to come back at a later stage. But it seems the one that has the least pressure on it in terms of numbers of people around the table here and consultants on behalf of the council. So I'm in your hands, Mr. Cully. I can either take as read what you've said, and we have heard a number of times this comment, and we have got it on our shopping list of things to go away and think about. So it's entirely up to you. And if that's all you came to talk about this afternoon, you want to disappear into the nice sunshine, then I do appreciate that.
That's very kind and understanding, Ma'am. So yeah, we don't have anything any more to add, I don't think, on this other than what's in the statement and the comments that we've made earlier. I'm conscious that the review issue and the needs of the Black Country have been raised a number of times over the last few days, and as you said, it's an issue that we'll be addressing in detail. So that's fine. So we're happy to for the examination to rely on the written statement and previous verbal submissions.
Thank you, that's helpful, Mr. Colley.
Okay, thank you.
So I'll take Mr. Chung next. This is quite a good start to it. Mr. Chung.
Can you see me? Can you hear me, Mark?
I can, yes. Presumably you're not telling me you're going off and.
No. For you and the rest of the people, sadly not. I'm afraid you're going to have to listen to me, hopefully fairly shortly, Ma'am. You'll recall, I mean, I appear alongside Mr. Mitchell on behalf of the Berwick estate, and you'll recall, Ma'am, that our interest lies to the northwest of Shrewsbury, and you'll have seen our representations, and we have a particular interest in terms of infrastructure with the the Northwest Relief Road, the Shrewsbury Northwest Relief Road, and we haven't really seen an answer to the points that we raise in any of the council's representations, and our point is that although the road, of course, is not in the plan, about which we have some observations as well, but as you know, the road is not actually in the plan, but nonetheless, the plan relies upon the delivery of the road to meet the housing numbers, in particular the allocation SH173, SHR rather 173, which is a sizable allocation, and the plan is clear that cannot come forward until the road has been provided. And we made some points about the deliverability of the road in our representation. And in brief, they are, first of all, there doesn't seem to be any up-to-date costings for this road. So we were given a cost some time ago of 87.1 million, which was then reduced to 80.1 million. But of course, since then, we know that there's been significant hike in prices, especially construction costs. So we don't have an up-to-date figure for the costing of the road. And also, we make the point that there's a funding gap for the road. Now, in the infrastructure plan, we're told that the funding gap will be addressed later, but of course it needs to be addressed now. So, for example, we're told that £17 million is committed from the council. We raised the question as to whether this was ring-fenced, whether this was actually ring-fenced and where we could see in the council's budget, and then we've not been provided with that information, and we've not been able to find it anywhere. If it's available, by all means, we're happy to look at it. So that there's a 17 million gap there, of which there's a question mark. And then there was LEP funding of 4.2 million, which our understanding was that had to be accepted by 2024. And it's clear that because work on the road hasn't started, we don't think the council are going to be able to accept that funding by that date. Thirdly, the road is dependent upon contributions from another allocation, which is a saved allocation, which is the west of Shrewsbury allocation, and there are trigger points in the section 106 for that site as to when they're going to make payments for the road. Now, delivery of that SUE is currently running behind schedule, and it's quite clear that it will not be making those contributions at the times that they're required to be made in order for the road to be delivered. And Mr. Mitchell, in his Reg 19 representations, set out a number of scenarios in terms of when the road realistically could start, given the funding that's required. And it's quite clear that already the road is behind schedule, and considerably so. And as a consequence of that, that has a knock-on effect for the delivery of SHR 173. And it's clear to us, and Mr. Mitchell can take you through some of the scenarios if that would assist, but it's clear to us that the road is not going to be available, not going to be built in time for SHR 173 to actually make any contribution to the housing numbers that the council are relying on. And in addition, we we also question whether we know that the Shrewsbury West SUE is running behind, so there's a timing point. The contributions that it was going to make are not going to be available on time. But also there's a viability point. I mean, there's been no viability reassessment of Shrewsbury West to see whether it is able to make the contributions that the council are relying on. So, for example, in the breakdown, they're relying on £8 million coming from the Shrewsbury West SUE, and there's no evidence at present that that is a development that will either come forward on time to make that contribution, or whether it's viable, whether you can viably make that contribution. So there's almost a sort of a pincer movement going on here in terms of which threatens the delivery of the road, and which means that the council will not be able to deliver the sites upon which it relies. That was all I was proposing to say into question one, but you now said that actually you want give everyone one opportunity to say what they want to say. So I'll make the second point as well, which is that we feel that there's an easy fix to this, and the fix to this is that there must be much more resilience built into the plan in terms of delivering housing at Shrewsbury. You'll recall last week I made the point that the plan is very much about being urban focused. Shrewsbury is at the top of the hierarchy. That's where the council wants to put its housing. And yet, and also it's very important to observe that there are some unique circumstances, unique considerations which apply to Shrewsbury as a result of the road. And that's recognised at page 268 of the plan, where the council themselves recognise it in S16, which is the Shrewsbury Place Plan Area Strategy. They recognise that there will be opportunities for the area between the current settlement boundary and the road. There will be opportunities there for development, which of course is exactly where my client's land is situated. And much more resilience can be built into the plan by allowing housing to come forward between the existing settlement boundary and the line of the road. And that can be done through a simple amendment to SP10 in respect of, because the way the plan works at the moment, of course, is that if you're not allocated and you're not within the settlement boundary, you're in the countryside, so you're subject to SP10. And under SP10 housing, we're told that new market housing will be strictly controlled outside the development boundaries of, and then all of the settlements are listed. And we say that a lot more resilience and flexibility could be introduced into the plan and should be introduced into the plan to amend that and make an exception in the case of strategic centre of Shrewsbury. And the exception would be unless that housing is brought forward as part of a whole estate plan, which is another policy in the plan to which we are subject. So there's a very easy way of introducing flexibility to the plan, which would ensure that any shortfall in housing as a result of the delay to the delivery of the road is made good by the land controlled by my clients, but also that land can help to achieve many of the other objectives of the plan, including of course helping to fund the road, the biodiversity offsetting that's required for the road, not to mention of course they require land owned by my client to actually deliver the road, and all of that could be made much easier and much more certain if the plan were to be modified in the way that we say. Without such modification, our submission is that the plan is not sound because it can't deliver the infrastructure upon which it relies, and it can't deliver the allocations upon which it relies. So, put briefly, that's our position. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chung. I'll come back to the council on that. There may be other people have similar comments in terms of the Northwest Relief Road. If the council can just put their camera back on. Right. In responding to that, it'd be helpful to pick up a couple of points for my own notes. First of all, from memory, I can't remember when SR 173 was due to deliver. So what the when that was going to start delivering housing. And I think from memory, you said the Northwest Relief Road was expected to get a resolution from committee. Was it later this year, or am I mixing that up with the Historic England issue?
No, you're not mixing that up. That's correct. So I'll take the first point, the first question. I've already forgotten. So
When is SHR 176 due to deliver? 173.
yes, years 6 to 7 in our trajectory. 7 to 8. Apology.
2027, 28 is when it's.
2027, 28.
And,
Okay.
and we deliver, yeah, up to 38 units a year from that point. That's in our trajectory. I will obviously caveat that, and I think the site promoter's on the call as well today, but there is obviously a live planning application for that site at the moment as well. But in our plan making process, which is obviously what we're here to talk about, and our trajectory, that is when we are looking at that's when that site will be delivered. So that's the first point. In terms of the second point about when the Northwest Relief Road proposal will be going to committee, yes, you are correct. It is later this year, autumn this year is when it's expected to go. It's obviously a live planning application at the moment. As you would expect on a development of that scale and nature and complexity, it's obviously a significant application, and there are a lot of conversations happening with like the Environment Agency at the moment in order to remove any concerns about that site. So that's what's going on at the moment. A committee later on this year, and I will say, obviously, we're not here to predetermine the decision there, or indeed the committee report into that. But if I could just clarify that it is obviously a major council objective and priority on that point. Hopefully that kind of makes the point clear about the council's prioritisation, where it indicates that road is in its wider context.
Thank you, that's helpful. And in terms of the housing, SHR 173, is it the case that none of the housing can be delivered until the road's completed, or is there sometimes you can build so many? And
the council's case is that is the case in terms of the road has to be completed before a dwelling can be occupied. I think that is the phraseology we've used in the guideline for the allocation. So that is what the council's position is on that. Again, I'm aware, don't want to speak for other people on the call, but there are other people on the call, most notably the site promoter, who I believe has an alternative view on that position.
okay, and do you know, this might be beyond your knowledge, how long is it expected that the road would take to construct? What's the anticipated sort of, in a best case scenario, which what would be the likely opening date of that?
I understand from colleagues in highways that it is likely that the opening date is the end of 24 is when we are expecting that to be open.
Okay.
That is what on the current trajectory against where we are with our planning into that process at the moment.
Okay, that's helpful. And so do you want to just now address some of these concerns of Mr. Chung about funding? So we've talked about funding from the council and the LEP, etc.
Yeah, the funding which Mr. Chung refers to is in the is contained within the strategic infrastructure and investment plan. Page number 71 of that plan, and identifies the funding which is already identified. So it includes the 54 million from the Department for Transport, the 19.8 million that Shropshire Council will be putting into that process. That's included within the council's capital programme. So it's ring fenced for that purpose, and I think Mr. Chung raised a concern whether that was or not. I can confirm that that is confirmed. March's left funding, that is in there as well. So Mr. Chung has already identified that. So that is our most up-to-date position on the funding arrangements for that construction.
Okay, and does it rely on money, as was indicated by Mr. Chung, from the SUE, the Shrewsbury SUE West?
The Northwest, if I can explain, the Northwest Relief Road is, whilst it's one road, it is made up of two parts, and the first part used to be called the Oxon Link Road. So if you look in the saved allocation in the Sandev plan for the Sue West site, there will be reference to the Oxon Link Road. That is the first part of the wider Northwest Relief Road. The wider road became a possibility once we got the funding from government, and then therefore it became a reality. So in terms of the Oxon Link Road part of the wider scheme, that relies on roughly £8 million of developer contributions from the Shrewsbury West SUE. Mr. Chung referenced that there had been concerns about how well that SUE was delivering. I can perhaps reassure Mr. Chung and hopefully yourself as well that there is now that site is now being delivered. There is a developer on site. David Wilson Homes are developing the phase 1 for that site of 344 dwellings, I believe. And they are contributing roughly 2.6 million of the wider contribution towards the Oxon Link Road. That has been agreed within a Section 106 agreement. And with agreements of a time frame about when that will be paid based on numbers of dwellings completed. I think Mr. Chung referenced the concern about, well, there's been a delay, therefore you won't get the Section 106 until later, therefore there's a concern. We don't view that as a concern, because clearly the council has the ability to underwrite that, to fund it up front, in order to facilitate any delay. Obviously that's a decision for the wider council to make if it needed to do that based on a time frame and certainty, but that's certainly an option of the council if it was needed to do that. So I don't see that as a concern, but and indeed I would say that the delivery of that site is now commenced, and then therefore the Section 106 contributions, and there are Section 106 contributions in this instance, will be coming in over the course of the next number of years.
Thank you. So when you say the council would underwrite it, so that the council would provide the funds and then recoup it back from David Wilson Homes at an appropriate point?
Effect, yes.
And there's been no indication from David Wilson Homes that they're going to seek to amend the 106 or in terms of that funding?
No, what's happened actually with that site, actually, it was a original, without going into too much of the specifics about that particular location, it was an original application for a certain number, 296, with a Section 106 agreement. That was amended relatively recently in the last 18 months with a refresh of the Section 106 agreement. So the Section 106 agreement is new, it is fresh, shall we say, in that respect. So issued the 1st of March this year, indeed. So really hot off the press in that respect. So well, as hot as plane ever gets off the press. So it is new. So no, in answer to your specific question, Mark, no, there's no concerns that we have at the moment about that particular point.
Just following on from that, the commencement of the site followed very shortly after the issuing of that decision. So there's a clear sort of timeline, if you like, for that.
Thank you. Before I move to the next speaker, is there anybody? Is there anything else you want to say that on that? I think I've got everything I needed from you.
Well, in that case, then I will be quiet.
Okay, it may rear its head again at some other point, but Mr. Cully, have you still got your hand up from before? Have you forgotten to take it down? I assume so. Mr. Deeves.
Thank you, Mrs. Crosby. I'm grateful that you're taking these points together. I would like to deal with some aspects of question 2, 3 and 4 and possibly 5. I start from EV067, the strategic infrastructure plan produced by Shropshire Council. We consider, first of all, generally that infrastructure includes energy and renewable energy supply and also public transport. And we note that, for instance, in the national framework at 155C, opportunities to develop energy supply from decentralised and renewable sources, and at 156 in the national framework to include developments outside areas identified in local plans to support community-led initiatives. Also, as you'll be aware, for public transport, the national framework at paragraph 85 sets out what needs to be considered for community needs in rural areas. The first point is regarding question 2, whether the has been proper consideration of these aspects of infrastructure. We can find no evidence in 067 of access to energy supply being considered. Indeed, we find it remarkable that no document from Western Power Distribution, who are the predominant local distributor for most of Shropshire, although Scottish and Southern carry a small part of this in the north of the area, actually appears at all. We find that remarkable and disturbing, shall we say. And of course, therefore, how can their considerations be taken into account in terms of supporting the proposed developments in the plan? Secondly, other than whether developments near a bus stop, we can find scoring, and this was discussed in other sessions earlier regarding how public transport access is scored in the way in which developments are regarded. But we can't find, this is the cart and the horse, we can't find any consideration of public transport as a large-scale infrastructure area for the whole area, only along the corridors identified. The other point.
Do you mean an increase? Do you mean an improvement in infrastructure in public transport infrastructure?
Well, I think a provision would be a good place to start, ma'am, but certainly an improvement. The other point that is worth stating, there is a local transport plan provided by Shropshire Council at EV0070 dot, and it's relate 02, for instance. Although that is entitled the provisional strategy, it's worth noting that this document was actually written in 2011, and it was pretty much at the beginning of the previous planning cycle. So we would submit that should be and it's described as provisional even then. So we would hold that this is a document that is of no real merit. We know the Shropshire Council is consulting on local cycling and walking plans as we speak, and those will obviously be material to infrastructure should they produce a result. Okay. So there is no consideration, as far as we can see, of Western Power as a source of energy. We can see no consideration regarding consideration of renewable energy in the plan, either by consultation with industry bodies, consultation with some landowners, or just consultation with communities about how they should want to do this. The council may well say that in their document 067 at page 9, where in section 4, where it starts to deal with the place plans. Can I give you? Do you want to turn that up, Margaret? Maybe. Helpful.
Are we on the IDP? Sorry.
This is the infrastructure strategic plan, delivery plan. Yes, the IDP, I think.
Yeah.
Call it.
Which page? Sorry.
Section 4 at page 14 onwards, where the place plans commence. I'm not proposing to deal with any particular place plan. what I would note is
Just
that
a second, I think I'm not on the same document as you because that's flood risk in the IDP. I've got a hard copy of it. Just let me find the right document online. That's probably easier because
yes, ma'am. Okay, thank you.
just remind me of the reference number, please, Mr. Davis.
It's 067, ma'am. EV
Are we on a
06.
car document or an evidence-based document?
This is an evidence document. It's an EV, so I presume it to be an evidence-based document.
What's the title? Sorry.
Shropshire Council Strategic Infrastructure Implementation Plan dated December 2020.
Now that's what I've got as a hard copy in front of me, but page 14 doesn't seem to be. That says flood risk. Are the council able to help on this?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. I think this was one of the documents which we provided a updated version in as a result of your initial questions. So it was one of the bundle of additional documents where we updated our position. So it is under the it's a G reference now, GC 410. Yeah, under the additional information provided by the council in the examination library. So I just useful to make sure you're looking at the right one, because I think the one you're referring to, Mr. Deeves, is the one on the evidence-based page, which this supersedes effectively. So.
Right, I'm sorry for any confusion that's created, ma'am. But the point is not specific to any place, as it were. The various tables that summarise infrastructure under the places refer to some planned activity by Western Power in terms of improving the distribution of power in that place, and are identified as projects that are needed for that place to grow. It is worth noting that these projects were already planned by Western Power. There is no evidence that they're the result of consultation with Shropshire Council. They're simply a replication of a list from Western Power. And I would further note, although it's open to you whether you accept it, that Western Power have just concluded their own 5-year planning exercise and have just had a determination from Ofgem about their investment cases going out from 2023 onwards for 5 years. Ofgem have removed a flat 20% from their capital and cost proposals, and they have only accepted as justified half of the specific projects that Western Power identified. I would suggest that that disconnect between the planning of Western Power and, in fact, the limitations that Ofgem have placed on their proposals for funding, compared with the way in which this plan has been prepared for this element of infrastructure, means that it is extremely unsound. Thank you. Is there one other point? I think that summarises all I wanted to say, unless there are specific questions. I have some points under question 16, but that I think will be later in the day. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Deeves. Do the council want to comment on anything that Mr. Deeves has said in terms of renewable energy access and public transport?
Yeah, in terms of, I think Mr. Deeves' first point about public transport, or particularly around the local transport plan, I think he does reference what is the most up-to-date version at the moment, which is relatively old. But I will just say that the council are fairly advanced in the preparation of the update to the local transport plan, and I know it's a question of who begins the process and who in this instance, a local plan is before the local transport plan, but we have specific conversations with our highways department and the consultants around that who are preparing the local transport plan on behalf of Shropshire. So you will see, hopefully in due course, when the local transport plan is published, that will align itself with what we're saying in terms of growth aspirations, both in terms of the wider growth agenda of Shropshire, but both specifically around specific around those place plan areas. So it's a point of alignment, and I will say it's very rare, if ever, that councils' documents in that context will ever line up. It is in that context, it's a who seeks to follow who, and are you reflecting the right plan? And in this instance, it's the local transport plan that will be reflecting the growth aspirations of the local plan.
Thank you. Presumably, if anything comes out of that local transport plan before this plan is adopted, then some of that could be fed in through modifications.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. It would be a really useful opportunity to do that. In fact, yeah.
Might I just add on that point? It's also important to recognise our approach to the spatial distribution of development. Very much directs development towards. I mean, we've spoken about this urban focus before, and that of course means that the majority of development will be in locations best able to access things like public transport. So I think that's a fundamental principle of the plan.
Thank you. I'll take Mr. Carter next.
Oh,
sorry, I didn't realise you hadn't. Sorry.
Sorry, I think I was going to respond to Mr. Dee's second point, which was about particularly around the energy issues. I think in terms of certainly the updated strategic infrastructure and investment plan, there is specific reference to Western Power in that, in terms of specific infrastructure items that we have are aware of and are relevant in the context of supporting development in those specific locations. So I would perhaps point you to that in terms of the update on that aspect. But in terms of just wider energy, in terms of that wider points about energy, Western Power and Scottish Power are effectively our network operators within the council. And I think perhaps I would make the point here, it perhaps wasn't specifically to Mr. Dee's point, but it's a wider power generation point, that Scottish Power, on the back of conversations that we have had, positive conversations we have had with them about the needs for specific upgrades in certain parts of the county, particularly the north of the county, to unlock development. They have had or are very close to completion on an £18 million scheme, which is a new power line between Oswestry and Wem, which by the laws of engineering, which I don't pretend to comprehend, unlock energy provision, electricity in places like Whitchurch, which has always been a concern. So I think again, that's perhaps a point about the system working in that respect. So I'll leave it there. I think information on that is included within the infrastructure plan as well. Yeah,
I've been through the IDP in quite a lot of detail, and I've seen those references to that in there. Did you want to say anything about renewable energy? That was a particular concern of Mr. Deeves.
Yeah, I think in terms of renewable energy, first and foremost, I point to the plan approach to renewables. So SP3, DP11 talk about renewable energy, and DP11 has a specific requirement for new residential development to include renewable energy, 10% renewable energy from the demand that's required. And then in terms of wider projects, DP26 specifically addresses sort of renewable energy and its associated infrastructure and sets out the policy considerations. I think we've got a very clear policy in terms of how renewable energy projects can come forward in Shropshire.
Thank you. So I'll take Mr. Carter next.
Hello, Mum. Can you see me and hear me?
I can.
Excellent. My name's David Carter. I work for the planning consultant Tyler Parks, and I'm here representing the Midlands Partnership Foundation NHS Trust and the Shropshire Community NHS Trust but also the sort of the wider NHS interests of the new integrated care board. What I would like to do, if I could, is just make a couple of points and then possibly just seek a clarification. Policy SP1, sorry, is clear that development must contribute to the health and well-being of the population, which implies that new development should help secure necessary supporting health infrastructure. And if it actually led to a deterioration in health services, then that potentially could make the scale of development unacceptable. The NHS is committed to working with the council to ensure effective delivery of health services located in the right places and the appropriate level, with the appropriate level of financial support secured through the development process where necessary. The question I would like to ask, if I could just ask for clarification, is that the infrastructure development plan has been mentioned a number of times, and can I check if that actually means the Shropshire Strategic Infrastructure and Investment Plan or not? I think it does, but can I just check that?
Yeah, it's the Shropshire's, it's a bit of a mouthful, Shropshire Strategic Infrastructure and Investment Plan 2022.
Yeah, so I was sort of wondering about that, and sort of, could you shorten it to SIP or something like that? But that's very helpful. Thank you for that. So in relation to question 1, my sort of first thought when I read this was, what is strategic infrastructure? The SIP and paragraph 1.1 of the council statement define this, but I think we would like to add to that understanding, if we could, which is that we think it's what's necessary to secure that development can go ahead without detriment to the existing community or existing infrastructure. Now, clearly that should embrace large-scale developments, as it does in the policies of the plan, particularly for the sort of strategic allocations. But we think it also needs to be clear that it applies to the implications arising from accumulations of smaller scale developments in the different areas of the council area, across the plan area. Without that understanding, which we think is indeed the right understanding, we think that at present health facilities within the plan would appear to be only considered partially, in the sense that it's only mainly the strategic allocations that are picked up. Now, we think it would be unreasonable to expect all necessary infrastructure requirements to be identified with precision at this stage, particularly for a plan with a long time horizon. And that's where we understand that the SIP comes in. However, it also appears to us that the plan needs to include a commitment to ensure that the full range of necessary infrastructure will be in place, and to specify the mechanisms to do this. This needs to encapsulate infrastructure across the board, including council services. The plan currently makes numerous references to the Shropshire Implementation Plan, and now we know that refers to the SIP, and that should be made explicit in the plan, but at the moment it isn't. The continuing refreshing of the evidence base to cover the full breadth of NHS services and indeed other services is required, and from our perspective we think an element of catch-up is required, and that can be achieved through the sort of the annual iterations that we understand will be done through the SIP. But the local plan needs to say that, and as far as we can see it, I mean, I think it probably mentions the infrastructure development plan possibly hundreds of times, but I don't think it actually makes that point. So therefore we think the SIP is incomplete as it is at the moment, and it's at an early stage, and that's not really that surprising because we think it's work in progress. In particular, we are currently working to extend and clarify the section of the SIP that deals with health facilities. We've not yet completed that work, but we could make that available to the examination if that would help, possibly at least stage 2 stage. I suppose that's a question for you, Ma'am, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's up to you what you submit, but we will come back to, I think it was policy SP1 you started off with, wasn't it? That will be considered in more detail at stage 2, along with lots of other development management policies.
Yeah, and in particular DP25, I assume, which is specifically deals with infrastructure. So we think that mechanism for the SIP needs to be basically made clearer within the policy, or at least within at least one policy of the plan. It's clearly not really necessary to refer to it in every policy, and most of the reference currently are in the sort of the reasoned justifications, but we think it should be included in the policy somewhere, and the contenders amongst the strategic policies are probably SP1 and SP2. Moving on to question 4, I don't think there's really a great deal to add, except that paragraph 4.3 of the council statement suggests that draft policy DP25, which we're sort of not considering today, sort of it sets out the overriding approach to infrastructure delivery. And I think, again, my question would that in that case would be, should that explanation commitment, call it what you like, or even the policy, should that policy actually be a strategic policy rather than a development management policy? And as I mentioned last week, obviously we continue to think that health infrastructure is considered as an essential priority alongside the other key infrastructure such as education and transport. But I mean, it is interesting. I mean, this is perhaps a comment for policy DP25 in stage 2, but the heading of that section is transport and infrastructure. I mean, I think I would see that transport is a part of infrastructure, and there's sort of perhaps it tells a story the way it's written. I don't think that I need to say anything else in relation to questions 6 and 7, Madam. I think it's the SIP is the answer to these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll ask the council to come back on that.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Is there anything you wanted to add before?
No, I don't think so. I don't think it was really just to cover some of those points that were raised.
Well, thank you. Firstly, we're very happy to hear the commitments of Mr. Carter for the NHS and Shropshire Council to work in partnership. That's very positive, and obviously that has been where we've been. In terms of the specific points that he makes, in terms of health provision, in terms of the broader point about how the strategic infrastructure and investment plan, which I agree doesn't roll off the tongue very well, how that's referenced within the plan. I do have noticed that there is reference within the plan to the local infrastructure plan, so maybe there's a need to be consistent for the plan on that point. So maybe that's a point where we need to go away and this be consistent in what we're referring to. That leads on to Mr. Carter's second point about a more explicit reference within the plan to this mechanism around a sort of annual review of this live situation, about the updated position and the importance of that, particularly around understanding around particularly infrastructure providers, capital investment programs. That's the real benefit of that process. You always get a kind of a rolling view of that. Now, our view on that would be we wouldn't be averse to including a specific reference within either the explanatory text or the policy to that process. it's a process which I think I've described already in last week's hearing session. I think it was the Wednesday's hearing sessions, I think, about has only recently had the formal senior management agreement to do that. So it wasn't possible to do it at the Reg 19 stage. So I think it might well be, just as a point of clarity, to make the policy more effective, we could do that. In terms of the wider point about infrastructure provision, where the DP policy sits, in terms of infrastructure provision, and whether that should be a strategic policy or not, I think you could read that as a strategic policy. I think where it sits in the plan at the moment is not, it feels right in terms of where it sits, but I can see if again, if you wanted to provide more clarity to the infrastructure issue, we could consider, again, as we did this morning with relevant parts of the plan, whether there was almost a lift and shift of that to the different part of the plan. I think that's something we could take under consideration as well. So those sort of more practical points. Obviously, I will just come back a little bit on some of the wider points which Mr. Carter makes about almost generally about health provision. And I know we're not getting into the bones of how much and where and, you know, Section 106 agreement. So no, we're not getting into that. But obviously, we think the plan as is has an effective mechanism to be able to facilitate that requirement at that point in the process on a planning application stage. Now, whether that be via SIL, and you can see from a reading of our policy approach that the SIL will be prioritised for our higher level critical needs and our wider strategic needs. Now, we have sought to identify that within the explanation of that policy around what those needs may be, and they do include medical facilities. If there was a need to elevate that into policy to make that more clear, again, that's something we could consider. I think it's clear enough as it is, but if you were minded that you wanted to make that perhaps more clear in the process, we could consider that. So a number of points there. I think it is worth mentioning though that, you know, through the conversations we've had, primarily with the CCG as part of this process, we don't feel as though we've missed anything, and indeed that has led on to specific reference within the plan on specific site allocations to the need or the potential need for new medical facilities on that site and the opportunities that site enables in delivering that. And there are a number of references in the plan to that. And so you've got that as the sort of the higher level option, and then you have the catch-all development contributions approach as the particularly around the SIL, I would say, around that cumulative impact of development, which I know is a point which Mr. Carter made. Obviously, the SIL can be very effective in banking contributions from a number of developments for one particular piece of infrastructure. So it's a more flexible approach than the Section 06, and obviously you know that anyway. But that's why we think it's a particularly useful mechanism in this instance. So I'll leave it there for this year.
Thank you. Yeah, and we can probably come back to DP 25 in when we at stage 2, when we'll that'll fall naturally into that process, and there's nothing to stop us deciding then that it should be a strategic policy as long as it's considered somewhere. I think that's probably the best thing. Yeah. Okay, so we'll move to Ford Parish Council now, please.
Yes, I'm just having trouble turning my camera on. I've got the sound on, but the camera seems to be a bit reluctant to turn on. Okay, yeah, so as you've been aware from the Matter 3 hearing session, Ford...
I don't think your camera's still on. I don't know whether is it a problem.
I
Is
can't
that-
get the camera on. It doesn't seem to want to unlock for some reason.
I
Can you
had that
do it
problem
with me
yesterday.
just speaking?
That's fine, yes.
Okay, sorry. So as you'll be aware from our representation,
Sorry, can you just tell me your name? Sorry to keep
so
interrupting.
I'm Rebecca Turner. I'm the parish clerk for Ford Parish Council.
Thank you.
As you'll have noted from our representation, we are opposed to being designated as a community hub, and one of our main concerns is the lack of infrastructure to make Ford a sustainable settlement, both now and in the future. And in that regard, we've got concerns regarding policy DP25 and also S16.2. At the present time, only a small proportion of the SIL money is guaranteed to go directly to the parishes, which is the SIL Neighbourhood Fund, which is approximately 15% in the case of a parish not having a neighbourhood plan. The SIL local is not necessarily spent within the local area that the development takes place, because basically the way that the SIL local spend area is defined is with reference to the place plan areas in Shropshire, which in Ford's case includes Shrewsbury and the whole rural area around Shrewsbury, which is quite extensive. And we feel that's a concern, because although the facilities because a lot of the facilities that people need to access day to day as a result of development in Ford aren't necessarily guaranteed to get any SIL local funding as a result of development that takes place in Ford, because it could be spent at somewhere in the wider Shrewsbury area that's not directly going to benefit Ford. And in our case, we've got an issue. We've also got a particular issue in that one of the key facilities, the secondary school, wouldn't in fact benefit from SIL local at all directly from the development, because our secondary school actually sits within another place plan area, the Ponsbury place plan area, rather than the Shrewsbury place plan area. So basically, we feel there's no guarantee in that policy DP25 regarding the SIL will remedy any infrastructure deficiencies as part of the development process. So we would suggest that for new development that the text for DP25 is amended, so that for new development where the community infrastructure levy applies, priority will be given to using funds to support and insert the word local as well as critical or statutory infrastructure requirements. And also, we think it's important to define local more tightly in relation to that it being in relation to the settlement where a development has taken place. So in Ford's case, if Ford is taken forward as a hub, local will be defined as the area that encompasses the Ford community hub. We also wanted to make a more specific point around policies 16.2, and this is in relation to the school, because the primary school in Ford is at capacity, and the proposed allocation is going to put additional strain on it. And we feel that Ford that the policy should be amended to say that FRD 11 will be developed in its entirety and will deliver lower density development to satisfy the settlement housing guideline and provide infrastructure improvements, and to insert the text.
Sorry, I'll just interrupt you, Ms. Turner. I just don't want to waste your time, because we'll be looking at the specific wording of these policies at stage 2 and not at this point. So we're looking at higher level infrastructure at the moment, and we'll come back to specific wording on DP25 and FRD 11 and things at stage 2 hearings.
Okay, that's fine. I think we just wanted to make the general point that in terms of the overall principles of how the SIL is allocated, it is very important that the local element of SIL goes to the area where the development has taken place. And the problem with it being defined at the moment by the place plan areas is that the place plan area can be very wide relative to the development and not directly benefit it. That's the key point we wanted to get across in terms of strategically how the SIL is allocated.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Thank you, Ms. Turner.
Thank you.
Just bring the council back in. I have read about this in a number of representations from areas. Do you want to, is there anything you want to say on that?
Yeah, I think I just make the point, man, that obviously the local plan isn't the mechanism to specifically identify exactly how we use SIL at the council. Obviously, the policy, which is, I know we're not talking about that policy here today, but it's hard not to really within this context to raise it. But obviously, the policy that we've referenced, the infrastructure provision policy, does talk about the generality of how we're going to use SIL, and that to support, in the first instance, the high level critical strategic infrastructure that will unlock development, because obviously that's what we are most keenly interested in this context. The last speaker referenced the 15% of SIL which goes to the parish and town councils, which obviously is in line with regulations, and depending on where you are, depending on how much growth an area has, that can be a relatively significant amount of money. We wouldn't expect that level of money. We wouldn't expect the parish and town council money to fund things like education places or highway improvements. It's more neighbourhood projects. That's the council's general approach to this. Indeed, it is not our money to tell them how to spend it. It's their money in that context. The money which remains with Shropshire Council, which is the 85% or the 75% of your neighbourhood plan area, that is obviously, it's up to Shropshire Council to determine how to use that in the most efficient way. The point of our approach in the plan is to direct that towards that level of infrastructure that is needed to unlock development. So that's what that policy is trying to get to. So that's why it includes items in the explanatory text, such as medical facilities, education, highways, because those are the things that we consider as a council are those infrastructure items which do help to unlock development. So that's a sort of a general approach to that. And obviously I've realised we're getting into the development management part of the process and we don't want to touch that, but it's quite hard not to in that context. I think my colleague just wanted to talk about specifically around education as well.
Yeah, I noticed Miss Turner made the point about the primary school. We obviously work closely with our colleagues in the school place plan team, particularly through the place plan process and I'm going to use STIP because it doesn't roll off the tongue. So they do that directly inform that process. In terms of the Ford School, as my understanding is that there are some places left in the school, albeit I appreciate that when you look at specific age groups, you know that's naturally the process. In terms of their approach, they continuously monitor the situation, and their view is at this point in time that watching brief is the most appropriate process, and that will inform when and if they consider it's necessary to invest in that school to support the development that's proposed in the area. Obviously, that's something that can be looked at the planning application stage for a particular development as well. So in terms of their views, that watching brief is appropriate in this instance, and it doesn't appear to be a priority for expansion over the short to medium term, but clearly in the longer term it could be. But I think that's why the infrastructure process it's an ongoing process, and they are monitoring the situation and will inform the planning application process when we get to that stage.
Thank you. I'll take Mr. Oves next. I think I've hopefully said your name correctly.
Yes, thank you very much indeed, and giving me the opportunity to speak. My name is Jim Oves. I'm representing Much Wenlock Town Council, the Much Wenlock Neighbourhood Plan, the Civic Society, and a number of other residents in the area. And I'm not a councillor, not a planning expert, just somebody who uses the infrastructure in this area. Our contention would be that the plan is unsound. We believe that there's sufficient evidence in the material that's been submitted to demonstrate that. In the council's response in M801, it references the fact that it was a robust, thorough and proportionate investigation or planning exercise. For that to be the case, the council would need to have identified the infrastructure requirements, and we would contend that the local plan does not actually do that. First of all, at a local level, things like the Much Wenlock neighbourhood plan, whilst referenced in the local plan, the key findings and direction from the neighbourhood plan have not been adopted. So things like, for example, gradual growth over time, so not disputing the numbers of houses to be built, but the speed at which they're built to allow for infrastructure to keep pace has been ignored. And that's despite the neighbourhood plan obviously being adopted through referendum, but similarly a referendum in the town some years ago saying that there should be a break on it until the infrastructure is sorted out. The second element then is the cumulative impact of that. So in looking at the content of the local plan for the locale, and just to clarify what I mean by that, I mean Telford and Wrekin, the Ironbridge Power Station development around Buildworth, Cressidge, Bridge North. So in that locale, we don't believe that the cumulative view has been taken. To be able to look at it and quantify the infrastructure requirements would require quite considerable engagement with some of the infrastructure providers. And it was interesting to hear Mr. Carter speak earlier on in the NHS Trust Response A0669, quote, where there's disappointment and concern that there has been no proactive engagement, which would infer, I think, that there has been insufficient engagement to be able to quantify what's required for medical provision in the area. We already have challenges locally, but also from the hospital perspective, it's also challenging. The second element of that is Telford and Wrekin's response A0662, where they have flagged the pressures on the local education. As been mentioned by some of the respondents earlier, effectively, if you look at Much Wenlock, the catchment area for educational needs is very broad. We are a rural area, but there are some quite populous areas that we draw from. The level of development in Bridge North and in Ironbridge, and indeed all of the development that's taking place in Telford and Wrekin, we get many school children coming to both the senior school and the infants and primary and junior school, from those areas, and we do not believe that that has been factored in. Similarly, transport. The next element, Madam Inspector, I am picking up really questions 1, 2, 6 and 7. I would ask you to rephrase the questions better than I am to the Shropshire Council. But if you take the next bit, in their M801, they reference EV 11501 as a document, which is important to show that they've consulted with infrastructure providers and landowners. In that particular document, in appendix, I think it's 4, it says just 12 working days for consultation. This is wholly inadequate considering the implications of adopting a document containing viability assumptions and judgments being flawed, untested, unreasonable and or unrealistic. That is a council document. So what does that mean? It means that the infrastructure requirements have not actually been quantified. We know that there are shortcomings already in because of flooding, fresh water provision. I myself have had to have bottled water because of demand in other areas in the locale. Because it hasn't been quantified, it cannot be costed. So how can anyone make a judgment that whether it's SIL or 106 funding, whatever, will actually cover the shortfall? And then the final point in this particular section, Madam Inspector, is that the phasing. The plan which is outlined shows that the short-term development in this locale would include Much Wenlock and Ironbridge from 2021 through to 2025. That allows no time for that infrastructure to have been quantified, no time for the funding to have actually been put on the stream, or indeed for it to be built and checked and found to be fit for purpose before there is extra burden on that infrastructure. The plan is wholly unsound. I would be interested in what the council has to say in terms of countering that particular position. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Oggs. Sarah, did you want to come in at all?
Yes, please. Sorry for interrupting. Council are having technical difficulties. They've confirmed that they can see and hear, but they're unable to respond.
Okay, so what I'll maybe do is, rather than inviting them to come back on Mr. Oggs, I'll take the next person and then we'll ask the council to come back. Oh, they're here again.
Okay, and we need to just, around a bit more.
This is our backup option, Mark. So we're all looking this way now.
Do I need to repeat anything from earlier?
No, we heard everything.
Very good.
Do you want me to give you a minute to get organised again, or are you okay to respond?
I think we're okay to respond, Mark.
I think the main points as I have them was about Much Wenlock neighbourhood plan, cumulative impacts on the area, in particularly transport and flooding, fresh water, and the lack of quantified or costed infrastructure required for development in that area.
Okay, thank you, Ma'am. I will attempt to respond to all 3 points. In terms of the neighbourhood plan point, I think this has been rehearsed a number of occasions, really. And certainly, I remember saying this last week as well. Obviously, we understand there's a lot of concern locally about the implications for the local plan review on the neighbourhood plan. But the fact of the matter is the neighbourhood plan takes us to 2026. This plan is obviously planning for 12 years more than that. And the indication that we had from the parish council, the town council, apologies, in Much Wenlock, was that they were not intending to update that neighbourhood plan. Therefore, we have to plan positively for that area. So there are references within the Much Wenlock settlement policy, which I know we're not speaking about today, but again, hard not to reference, and it's to the neighbourhood plan. But obviously, we have had to plan effectively for the remainder of the plan. So it's effectively the same answer as last week on that point. In terms of cumulative impact, I think I would reiterate the point I've already made today about the SIL. Actually, obviously, you know, there's a wider point here about the mechanism utilised in order to secure infrastructure improvements, necessary infrastructure improvements. And, you know, from my perspective, the beauty of SIL, or whatever will happen in the future with SIL and infrastructure funding, will be about the ability for councils to pool a number of developments into contributions from developments to support a wider piece of infrastructure, unlike obviously Section 106. Section 106 obviously still has a part to play, but still has that wider flexibility to take into account cumulative impact. And we'll go back again to the point about how we use SIL as a council is not something we can. It's not something we can specify in the local plan. It's something which comes through as an iterative process, which we are seeking to develop through our conversations with strategic infrastructure providers. We've already sought to do that as part of this plan making process. That's led on to where we are now with our infrastructure plan. We are proposing a new network, a strategic infrastructure network, which will include infrastructure partners. You will have information about that as an appendix to our strategic infrastructure and investment plan. And that is where we will capture both the
capital investment programs from those various partners. And inevitably, they will never align. These things never align, but there will obviously be information coming as part of that process to see what they are planning. We can influence that because of our growth agenda. But equally, there will be wider opportunities, particularly with people like education, particularly with people like the NHS and the CCG and the new iteration of the CCG, about getting into that process around requiring potential developer contributions, and the information from that annually will help to support how this council utilises the SIL to support specific infrastructure priorities. So that's the mechanism that we have utilised and continue to utilise. And I think we can point to examples of how that's been utilised very effectively. I've rambled. I think there was a third point, Ms. Crosby.
There was something as well about was that the previous speaker said about not engaging with engagement not undertaken as well with people like I think there wasn't a specific mention, but I presume it meant the Highways Agency or whatever they're called now, Highways England.
National Highways, I think.
National Highways, that's it.
Highways Agency, Highways England, National Highways, all the same. So they're not all the same. It's important separations, but no, National Highways. We've obviously. I'm not sure if they're on the call this afternoon. I believe they probably are, but we've obviously entered into a statement of common ground with National Highways about the potential impact from our growth proposals on their network, and you will have seen that statement of common ground, which is an agreed position between us and them, and again refers to future work on that. But that's inevitable, I think, within this context. But we have an agreed position with National Highways on that point.
So the council have engaged with other bodies, if you like, on all of these points.
We've engaged primarily through our Strategic Infrastructure Forum, which was the earlier iteration of what's now become the Strategic Infrastructure Network. It was a particular group where a number of infrastructure partners were effectively met with the council in order to discuss specific issues, but also around local plan making and growth aspirations and what that meant for both capacity on their existing network or wider infrastructure, but also around future funding potentially from their capital investment programs. So it's a similar to what we're proposing now through our strategic infrastructure network, just rebranded, I suppose, on that one. But it will include up to those partners as well.
Thank you, that's helpful. Okay, if I turn now to Ms Butterfield.
May I just come back on one point? Sorry, Madam Inspector. I just want to pick up Mr West on one point, which is if you take the neighbourhood plan.
Oh, sorry, Mr Orbs, I thought it was the council speaking. No, I've said that people can just have one opportunity to speak, otherwise other people are not going to have chance. So I'll turn to Ms Butterfield next.
Good afternoon, can you hear me?
I can.
Perfect, thank you. Before I start, I also have Steve Bates from PJA, sort of virtually sat next to me, who I'd like to introduce in a short moment. Sarah Butterfield from Pegasus Group, here representing Barwood Land, who are the land promoters for SHR 173, which has already been discussed. The points I think we'd like to really come back on is, and I think some of these are going to overlap into some of the site specifics, and I don't really want to do that as far as possible, but I think it's important to put forwards that Barwoodland do differ in their opinion on when the NWRR needs to be operational in association with the delivery of the allocation at Ellesmere Road. I'm going to bring Mr. Bates in to give some more what I'd call technical evidence in a minute, but we've included that in our hearing statements which have been submitted. And it's also in with the current outline planning application, where we propose that at least 150 houses could be delivered on the site without the NWRR being operational. We have therefore set out, and this is where I'm probably straying into stage 2. So please tell me if you think I am.
Yeah, I think we probably are already
wording.
in terms of this is a more high level.
I think that the point really is that we think that the policy should be flexibly worded so that it doesn't sort of artificially restrain the delivery of housing that could come forwards before the delivery of that infrastructure. But Mr. Bates is here to kind of give you that evidence on why we think that the site could deliver.
More of a stage 2 matter, and the benefit of that in a way is that by the time stage 2 comes around, which is going to be at least towards the end of this year, if not next year, we'll know a lot more about the Northwest Relief Road as well, won't it? So that'll give us all some benefits in terms of being able to discuss that in a more enlightened way, hopefully.
No, and that's fine. If you're happy that you don't need to hear that now, that's fine. We'll sort of come back at stage 2. But we are sat here to sort of just put that point forwards. Is that we appreciate the council have a different position, and Mr. Chung had a different position, but that is our position, and that is the evidence that we've put forwards.
Thank you. Yeah, that's useful to know in a broad sense, but we would have to come back to all the details anyway. I think SHR 173, and time will have moved on and things will have moved on, hopefully in a positive way.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Butterfield. Ms. Osmond-Smith.
Thank you very much, Madam. Hello, can you hear me? Good. Mum, you'll be aware from our submissions that we don't consider that the plan adequately secures the infrastructure required to support the development proposed. And part of that, we say, is that the evidence base is absent as to how the necessary infrastructure might be delivered. And I use Bridgnorth as an example here for obvious reasons, but it's a broader point that goes to the whole plan and its approach. Because the draft plan, of course, includes the place plan area policies which set out the allocations, and the main policy in respect of all of these, whether it's S3 or S16, is the aspirational part in terms of the requirements, and the detail on the site allocation follows in the schedules that come below the policies, and they're accompanied by development guidelines which set out the infrastructure that's actually required to ensure that those sites are deliverable, then followed by explanatory text. So you've got the policy, the schedule, the explanatory text, which sets it all out. But the problem is that the schedules and the explanatory text are, of course, not the policy itself. So we have allocations with guidelines, but no requirement for the infrastructure that's actually needed to make them work. And with sites like that, which is proposed in Bridgnorth, very large sites, strategic large sites, and also smaller sites as well, but might still run into the hundreds of dwellings. These are matters, we say, that need to be thrashed out now and properly considered and required by policy, because if the infrastructure is necessary to make the development acceptable in planning terms, then the plan has to acknowledge that now and plan for the delivery of that, not kick it off until a later stage with a general infrastructure policy, for example. And we see that, and again, I use Bridgnorth as the specific example to make the general point. But at Tasley, there's expected to be the village centre with the community centre, community uses land for a new school, a medical centre, if required, says the explanatory text, and highways improvements, which include the pedestrian and cyclist footbridge crossing the A458, and also park and ride. So that's all mentioned in there as sort of elements of infrastructure that would have to be delivered. And again, this is repeated throughout different allocations. The SIP says, interestingly, something different. So what you have is a policy aspiration for all intents and purposes expressed through explanatory text. But the SIP says, for example, in respect of the footbridge at Tasley, that it's required to facilitate Tasley Garden Village. So what there is a real lack of certainty about what is necessary in terms of infrastructure, what's nice to have, And then what of either the necessary or the nice to haves are actually able to be achieved. And of course, it's not unusual for policies to set out quite clearly what is required from site allocations in terms of infrastructure where that has been deemed necessary. But there's a real lack of clarity here about what's necessary or what might just be nice to have or what could be provided. And so we say that that should be set out much more clearly. In respect of the SIP, that is a company, that's EVO 67. I think probably you have that as a hard copy in front of you. And that has appendices, which are the place plans. And for Bridge North, that's place plan 03, which sets out a number of priorities, again, including upgrades to the A458 adjacent to the Tasley site, including pedestrian linkages, etc. But what you see when you read that is there is no estimated costs. There's no identified funding sources that have been confirmed, and very little in the notes to provide any comfort or confidence that that infrastructure is going to come forward. But even more surprising, and Madam, I'm sure you'll go and look at this in your own time, but Stanmore Garden Village is included within that place plan, which of course is my client's proposal that's no longer the preferred option. But that's the development that's referred to in that plan as potentially helping to alleviate flooding issues. So we get a mention in the place plan. Tasley has no mention at all. So it becomes clear that the document doesn't take into account Tasley, hasn't been informed by Tasley, a very large allocation which will of course have infrastructure impacts. There's just absolutely no relationship and no attempt to join up the dots there between what's in the plan and what's in the SIP and its infrastructure appendices. So that's a completely ineffective document. It has frankly zero value because it has nothing to do with Tasley. So there's a real sense that infrastructure here is an afterthought and very little consideration has been given to it, which of course is not the purpose of the development plan process, where this is supposed to incorporate joined up thinking. Now, we acknowledge that the SIP does go into some detail about what might be required at Tasley. Much of it is couched in words like potential. So again, a difficulty in understanding what's actually required in order to facilitate the delivery of this site, and undoubtedly others, but I focused my attention on Tasley for obvious reasons.
Thank you, Ms Osmond-Smith. I'll ask the council to come back on those points. So,
I think the first point I'd make is, as we discussed under the matter 7, is the purpose of the local plan. It sets the parameters for development, but we're very much aware, as I'm sure everyone is, that inevitably as you get to the planning application stage, the level of information available becomes more detailed. And I think that's inevitable because that's both with regard to the infrastructure and also the nature of the development that's proposed. So what the development plan seeks to do is establish the principles of the infrastructure requirements and makes it quite clear the assessments that are necessary to identify the specific detailed requirements, which will be investigated further at the planning application stage. What we feel we have done is identified those high-level requirements and ensured the overall viability of development, and also putting a structure in place to ensure that at the appropriate stage in the process, the infrastructure, the detailed infrastructure requirements, if you like, are specifically identified and brought forward in accordance with our other policies in the wider framework, if you like, with particular reference to DP25. We consider that quite clear. In terms of the strategic infrastructure and investment plan, there is specific reference to infrastructure associated with the various proposed allocations, including the example provided, Brid 30, Tasley Garden Village. There are a number of entries regarding medical and highway requirements, and the specific funding, i.e. developer contributions, is identified. We consider that to be clear and transparent and a consistent approach to the identification and delivery of infrastructure. Yeah, I think in terms of the infrastructure, it's also important to note that the wider site assessment process and the other studies that have informed that and the engagement that's been undertaken with the infrastructure providers, such as through the Strategic Infrastructure Forum that my colleague Mr. West previously referenced, have all informed those site guidelines. So those guidelines reflect our understanding of the infrastructure requirements of the development at this stage. Now, as I said, inevitably the level of information available will be refined as you get further down the process towards the planning application stage. So the level of information we have available to us reflects that. And we take a precautionary approach to things like infrastructure needs and also viability. I'm sure we're going to touch on that when we talk about the viability assessment. We've been very cautious in terms of likely contributions required from development to deliver infrastructure. And we consider that precautionary approach has ensured that the infrastructure needs are adequately drawn out, and also the infrastructure contributions associated with delivering those needs have been reflected within our viability assessment.
Thank you, and we'll return to the site specifics in much more detail at stage 2. Just one point that was made was about Stanmore Garden Village in the place plan, no longer in the plan, but relied upon to alleviate flooding.
Yeah, we'll obviously the reference to that is not up to date. The place plans are much like the infrastructure plan is an iterative process. So you're aware, just in case you weren't aware, Ms. Crosby, that they are sort of our localised infrastructure plan effectively for those 18 place plan areas. I think that's hopefully that sort of message has got through on that point. But they haven't been updated for a couple of years, and there's a practical reason for that. Was because of our we have a number of officers called place plan officers. So as the name would imply, they are responsible for updating the place plan, and unfortunately over the last couple of years their resource has been utilised to support the council's approach to COVID-19 on that point. So that there hasn't been an opportunity in the way we would have normally sought to do through an annual review of the place plans to update them. We are going to update them now. We're in a better position this year, so that will be amended this year, and obviously at that point we can put that in to the examination if you so wish. In terms of the specific point about the flood alleviation,
I don't think there's any suggestion that flood alleviation is dependent on what the guideline in the place plan was saying was that there was an opportunity to align the two projects in terms of alleviating flood risk in Central Bridgenorth. I don't think there would be any expectation that Stanmore Garden Village would be the solution to that. I mean, I'm not a hydrologist, but I'm not entirely clear how that could actually be the case, to be honest, given the geography of the area. I think it was more in terms of alignment of the two processes.
And I would say also in the existing place plan, it also talks about an infrastructure scheme, which is already included within the Environment Agency's 6-year programme as well. So more information around that. So we don't what we're reading here. We don't think it's reliant upon the delivery of Ms. Osmond Smith's client's land in order to achieve that.
I think the other thing to note is, of course, that this, whilst it's an important infrastructure project, certainly it is not a project that's necessary to support a development proposal. It's a project to alleviate flood risk within the existing built form of Bridgenorth. So there's a slight distinction there in terms of the nature of the project, and of course it reflects the fact that the place plans and our strategic infrastructure plan is not just about identifying the infrastructure to support our development proposals. It's about identifying infrastructure priorities across Shropshire.
Thank you. So next I'll take Mr. Green. I noticed, Mr. Chung, you've got your hand up again. I did say people would only be able to speak once. Is it something different you wanted to refer to? Or I'll just take Mr. Chung. I'll find out why.
Mum, I was hoping to answer some of the points that the council has made, but I fully appreciate if the rule that you're operating is everybody gets one go, then obviously you have to respect that.
Okay, I'll see what time we've got as we move through. Okay, I'll take Mr. Green next. Okay.
Thank you, Inspector. Hopefully you can see me and hear me.
Can.
I just wanted, my points are, general points really all on infrastructure, of course, and implementation and costing and sources of funding. And there are 4 points, four subjects. I'll start with the Northwest Relief Road, which is, of course, we know it's the largest proposed piece of infrastructure in the county. It is listed in the SIP, SSIAP, which I think you have in front of you. You said, and the reference I'm looking at is GC4T. I think there have been 2 references previously to the previous version, which was EV067. So the version I'm looking at, just incidentally, I think I did an electronic search and there are actually 11 references to Tasley Garden Village in it. That's not my point here. So I'm looking at page 71 at item 12V.
Yeah.
Which is the entry for the Shrewsbury Northwest Relief Road, and it shows there the committed funding, which Mr. Chung has touched on, and that adds up to 87.1 million, which is 74.2 million for the Northwest Relief Road section. They separate it out, but it's all the same road now. It's because it was originally the Oxon Link Road was the first stage of it, which has got some funding from the Marches LEP and the 8 million from the SU that was talked about, and I think there's some SEL money in there, but the main funding is from the DFT, 54.4 million, and then Shropshire Council have to stump up 19.8 million. It's already been raised that the roads are considered a prerequisite for only one site, which is SHR 173, and I just refer you to the actual plan and page 274, which is the part of the S16 policy for Shrewsbury, what it actually says about SHR 173 for 450 dwellings. The policy says development on the site will not commence until such time as the Northwest Relief Road is operational. So no development until the Northwest Relief Road is up and running. But my doubts really are about the deliverability of the Northwest Relief Road and whether it does remain adequately funded. Mr. West has said the planning application is expected to go before committee rather in November. But I think there are still unresolved matters with the EA relating to the Shropshire groundwater scheme, and there's also geological difficulties at the river crossing, there's a huge channel there left over from the Ice Age. The bedrock is a long way down, so I think there are going to be structural problems there. And as you know, it has attracted a phenomenal level of objection. So it's by no, of course, it's a planning application by Shropshire Council to Shropshire Council. So of course they expect it to go through, but there are doubts about it. Those figures that I read out from the SSIAP are based on budgets within an outline business case of several years ago. And the council's hearing statement for matter 8 on other matters gives an indication of just how much building costs have increased recently. So page 11 of their submission details an 8% increase in costs for houses over a 28-month period. So goodness knows how much road building construction costs have increased over what amounts to a much longer period. And going back to the page 71 of the SIP, there is a column there, funding gap, to be confirmed at the conclusion of final business case preparation, November 2022. So the expectation is that the final business case will show costs hugely more than 87.1 million. And just finally on the Northwest Relief Road, I'm just looking at my notes. It just so happens that yesterday there appeared on the website for the Northwest Relief Road application, which is 21009240, oblique 00924 oblique EIA, an emailed letter from Helen Morgan, the new Lib Dem MP for Shropshire, to one of her constituents, which clearly expresses her reasons for opposing the plans. I just mention this by way of the high level of opposition, on the grounds of increased congestion for her constituents, environmental damage and excessive cost. So she starts off saying Shropshire taxpayers will cover 100% of any cost overruns on the road, in addition to what is already committed to it. Given inflation in the construction industry since this project was initially proposed, and the fact that large infrastructure projects often exceed their budgets, I don't think we can afford it. I would rather see improvements to the pinch points on the existing ring road and much needed investment in our market towns. So that's what I say on the uncertainty as to the deliverability of the Northwest Relief Road. My point number 2 was on the local transport plan, which is alluded to by Helen Morgan there, that there is a need to spend the money on improving existing roads rather than building new roads. So it's a point we raised in our hearing submission, that the local transport plan, as has been alluded to already, is out of date. It's LTP3, quite old, 2011, I think. And LTP4 is being consulted on and hopefully will be a better document. And then thirdly, just picking up on a point of Mr. Deves on renewable energy and the council's approach to that. The NPPF in paragraph 155 does say, to help increase the use and supply of renewable and low carbon energy and heat, plans should A, provide a positive strategy for energy from these sources that maximizes the potential for suitable development while ensuring that adverse impacts are addressed satisfactorily, including cumulative landscape and visual impacts. It goes on to say, consider identifying suitable areas for renewable and low carbon energy sources and supporting infrastructure there where this would help secure their development. So there's a clear indication in the NPPF that that is an expectation. Policy DP26, which is the relevant development managed policy, simply doesn't do that. And then finally, can I make a point on community infrastructure levy, CIL, with the word infrastructure in the middle of it? And it's a point that is, well, it's in our hearing submission. There's detailed figures on CIL there, but the point is that a lot of money has been collected by Shropshire Council, now on the latest figures available over 52 million. But very little has actually been, or a relatively small proportion of that has actually been spent on infrastructure. Some of it has been committed. They've earmarked some ways of using it, but it hasn't actually been spent. So I'd just ask you to look at that schedule again in our submission there. It's I think it's about the 6th. That's the page 4 and page 6 of our hearing submission, which
yes, I've seen that. Yeah.
Which are referenced 37 of 65 and 45 of 65. And I'd say that's the point, really, that CIL does not seem to be a way of actually providing the infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Green. So in terms of the council, I think you've already answered some of those points. In terms of the Northwest Relief Road, it might be worth picking up on inflationary costs and how those would be met in funding terms. I think some of the points about the renewable energy and that some of that goes to matter too, but if you want to pick up on some of those points now, then.
Yes, I've already rehearsed the North West Relief Road, so I won't reiterate that. You've got that already. In terms of inflationary pressures, well, we are realists here. Of course, we realise that there are inflationary pressures at the moment. The business case, the full business case, will be put in at the end of this year. That's having had a conversation with our highways department, and that will set out the costs at that point in time. All I can say at this point is that we don't see any concern at the moment about those costs being met. So I can't really elaborate any more on that at the moment, obviously.
No, that's fine.
Progress on that one. So that's in terms of the point about LTP. I think that's probably already been. I think it's already been out in terms of an earlier point anyway. So I'll leave that there. In terms of the point about the SIL and the amount that has come in and not spent, I will actually thank Mr. Green because he's just proven exactly my point here. It's a really effective mechanism for collecting money to support infrastructure, and as I've mentioned, it is the council's council has the role. We are the custodians of the SIL. We have to spend it in the most efficient way, and part of that process is to bank it for future years. It is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. We will spend that on our highest priorities, aligned with supporting our planned growth in Shropshire. So the fact that there's a lot of money in the bank and not much committed is a good thing, in my opinion. So I will leave that there, and I think my colleague will just pick up on that good point about the renewable energy points.
Yeah, thank you. Mrs. Crosby, you obviously made the point that this is a matter for stage 2, so I won't go into too much detail, other than to say we consider we have a clear strategy for the supply of renewable and low carbon energy, and that is within policy DP26, which we consider to be consistent with Para 155 of the NPPF, but no doubt we will look at that in greater detail at that future point.
Thank you. So what I'll do, I'll take Mr. Grace and then we'll take a comfort break. So Mr. Grace, you've been patiently waiting, you're bottom of the pile.
Yeah, hi there. Thank you very much indeed. Appreciate it. An interesting conversation. Yeah, Mike Grace, Much Wenlock and Associates. Yeah, I think following up on the comments that have been made, I just wanted to make a number of points here. I think one of the fundamental issues with the local plan is not considering places like Much Wenlock as a place. It's being very much driven by a single site process, and it's kind of turned the place planning on its head, really. And the Much Wenlock place plan area is not very functional anyway, and the place plan and the local plan don't connect, as we've just heard from other places too. And because the Shropshire Council decided essentially to set aside the neighbourhood plan in Much Wenlock, it hasn't, despite what national policy says, it didn't pick up on the key policies in the document. So it didn't pick up on the whole, the big thrust that the community wanted in neighbourhood plan, which is about small scale sites, limited development, local needs. And because it set those aside, despite those national steers, despite ministers' statements and all those sorts of things, it meant that it forgot how, and didn't really take into consideration how Much Wenlock works as a place. Now that has big implications for the way infrastructure and viability start to play out. One, it excludes other solutions aside from significant scale of development. So there was a reference earlier to working with the Environment Agency and its 6-year plans and so forth for flood management. Well, that appears in the place plan, just has disappeared completely from the local plan. The £43 million for River Severn catchment has disappeared as well. That's not been considered. So it turns back in on itself to, well, what can a development do now? The site the Shropshire Council have chosen for Much Wenlock is on the wettest field in probably the wettest town in the county. So it shouldn't be there in the first place, in principle. So the whole cost of delivering that site is turned in on just delivering on the flood infrastructure. So that leaves, as Theo Osmond-Smith was talking about, it leaves a big gap. There are lots of shortfalls, and you can't just say leave it till later. And so the viability, will that one site deliver on public transport? Will it deliver on affordable housing? Will it deliver on active travel and so forth? Probably not. So where does SIL kick in? How can that help? None of that is explained in the local plan. It's certainly not in the place plan, and it's not in the SIP either. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Grace. I'll ask the council to respond on that, and then we'll take a short break.
I think the response that I would make on that is obviously we've already rehearsed where we see the infrastructure, where we pitch it in terms of the local plan. It is a strategic about how we identify specific infrastructure at an appropriate point in the
I think the
process.
sound and the picture's breaking up, Mr. West.
Oh.
I wonder if you're overheating.
Personally or the room? Probably both.
Could be both, I suspect.
Yeah, could be both. Are we okay now, or is it? Or
yeah, it's come back now. He was going
okay.
to. Oh, it started breaking up. Should we take a break and let it cool down for a short while, and then?
It might be a good idea, Mark. Yeah. Okay.
So if we have a break for 15 minutes and put your equipment in the fridge, and we'll come back at 3:15. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Grace.
can also point to the fact that our approach to employment sites is more
We're back on the big screen.
Right, you look clear and well, and
Well,
We're also in zoomed in mode for some reason, but we don't. That seems to come and go at the machine's whim rather than ours.
that's fine. Imagine your machinery being something like that Herbie car from the film in the 70s.
Well, it's about a 6 foot wide screen we've got you on, so you are seriously on our wall.
Oh, that's not a good thing. Okay, so we'll come back on Mr. Grace's points, and then I've got a couple of points, and then we'll move on through the agenda.
Shall I start? I don't want to move on to the viabilities per se, but it's difficult not to when there was a specific reference to the site, MUWO12VAR, and equally I don't want to move on to stage 2. But just in as a high level comment, I'd say the viability topic paper EV113 includes sort of a summary of further correspondence that we undertook with site promoters. We'll probably talk about this a bit more under the viability questions, but I would note that with specific regard to that site, the site promoters do specifically confirm that, in effect, the guidelines proposed for the site are viable. They consider they can make the necessary affordable housing contribution and make the necessary SIL contribution. So I think in terms of the viability of the site promoter is very much of the view that their site is viable, given having regard to the requirements of the plan, in effect.
Thank you.
Can I just come back on, I think, on a wider point really, because sort of this neighbourhood plan point is raised by Mr. Grace on this point, as have others from Much Wenlock as well. It's a point I made last week, but I will reiterate it because I think it's important. There's nothing here that we're proposing now which would prevent Much Wenlock undertaking a neighbourhood plan in the future. Obviously, there has to be alignment between the neighbourhood plan and the Shropshire local plan, whatever that is at that point in time, but there's nothing to prevent them to do that if they feel as though, going back to Mr. Grace's point about sense of place or understanding the place a bit more, if there was a need for them to do that as part of that process. Obviously, that's one of the good things about neighbourhood plans. It can add a little bit more colour to a local area where perhaps a local plan can't, because of the nature of, because we are a very large county with many settlements.
Thank you. So there's just Mr. Chung left with his hand up. Mr. Chung, I'm not going to allow you to come back. I think we haven't got the time this afternoon, I'm afraid. And I am conscious that the site you refer to, we will be discussing again at stage 2. So there will be an opportunity to address me again then on those points, and things might have, well, hopefully they will have moved on in some way, one way or another. We might have some more clarity on the road and lots of other points then. Okay.
Thank you, Mum. I understand, and as you said, there's an opportunity later in the year, perhaps early next year, and rather than speculating, both myself and the council, as to what will happen, is capable of happening, we'll have further information and we'll see whether I was being unduly pessimistic or whether the council was being unduly optimistic.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you. I've just got one question for the council before we move on to question 8, and that was just a quick question about the SAMDEV sites and whether the infrastructure needed for the delivery of those are included in the IDP.
Yeah, thank you, Mrs. Crosby. We are of the view that the infrastructure required to support the delivery of the SAMDEV allocations is recognised in the strategic infrastructure investment plan. I think we're going to have to come up with a snappier name, aren't we?
Yeah.
Yeah, but yes, we consider that it is, and that's been informed obviously by the site guidelines that are in the adopted plan as we come to speak.
Thank you. And then I think we can get through the last couple of questions on this section fairly quickly. So the next point, the council provided an infrastructure funding statement. The PPG says that this should set out anticipated funding from developer contributions and the choices local authorities made about these how these contributions will be used. However, the council's document seems to be backward looking rather than forward looking. I don't know whether you want to comment on that. And I think at the time I did these notes, it wasn't on the examination website. It was another question about whether it should be on the examination website, that document.
Sorry, if you go with 1 second, Mark.
Yeah. I think just to start off, our view is that there's a requirement within the infrastructure funding statement to document funding that's being collected and spent. So there is a necessity to include that sort of backward-looking aspect of it. It does include, in our opinion, sort of a look forward in terms of infrastructure. I guess it's a question of how far forward you want to look. Our approach is being quite targeted in terms of how far it looks forward. It looks forward sort of at the immediate term. That's our sort of view. But clearly this is it's a rolling document and it's updated annually. And obviously we're getting towards the point at which this would be updated. Its natural sort of cycle for the update is fast approaching, if you like. So yeah, I think that would be our view on it in the first instance.
So maybe in that review, it's something to think about, because the PPG goes on to say at examination, this can be used to demonstrate the delivery of infrastructure throughout the plan period. So that envisages a much longer period. So
yeah, I think what we do reference is place plans, I believe, we reference that. But I think it's something we can consider actually in terms of obviously the infrastructure funding statement is I think we're a couple of years into this now, obviously post 1, 2, 3 lists and still. And I think it's certainly something we could evolve into that. And I can see how it might be helpful from your perspective as well.
Thank you.
Just to follow on it, there is a specific reference to the implementation plan as well. Obviously, again, maybe if we make that reference to the strategic infrastructure investment plan, that may well help as well. But yeah.
Thank you. I can see you've got your hand up, Mr. Carter. I'll just point out that under questions 9 and 10, I'm happy to take as read what the council have said there, unless anybody else has got any comments. Mr. Carter, did you want to comment on question 8?
Yes, thank you, ma'am. What I was going to say that our understanding of this statement on page 2021, it states that on page 9 that the infrastructure list sets out the infrastructure projects or types of infrastructure which Shropshire Council intends to be wholly or partly funded by SIL. The list is place-based and includes few references to health facilities. The only one that I can spot immediately is reference to the Shrewsbury Business and Healthcare Campus. So, I mean, I think I said last week that we were concerned about sort of the lack of consideration really of health facilities through the viability study and the SIL and this sort of thing. So it is important to recognise that funding for some medical facilities is noted in the SIL report of that document, which is obviously welcome and demonstrates the commitment that I think that the council were talking about earlier. But I thought it was just drawing that to your attention as, you know, a further indication of the need for this ongoing work, which is actually then sort of dealt with in the remaining questions. But I don't think I need to add anything to the things I've already said in relation to that process and the commitment of the NHS to that. Thank you.
Thank you. So you're happy you've covered 9 and 10 questions?
Yes.
I think it all kind of ends up getting wrapped up, doesn't it? And,
yes,
and I suppose the council, now they've heard what you've said, they've said that they're going to be updating this infrastructure funding statement. Maybe it's an opportunity to work with yourselves as well on that more.
Yeah.
And,
yeah.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Carter. Did the council want to come back at all on anything before we move on to viability?
I don't think so, aside from indicating that we would obviously welcome the partnership approach with the CCG and NHS, or the equivalent of the CCG in the future, on that infrastructure funding stuff. I think that's all I'm saying.
Thank you. So, Mr. Orves, did you want to, are you got your hand up front of the queue for viability, or is it about something else?
Apologies, Madam Inspector. It was just around Q10, really around how infrastructure providers will be engaged going forward. So commented on the previous one about lack of involvement previously. What is the mechanism? How will they do that going forward? In particular, we heard about the NHS, but I'm thinking more of things like Severn Trent Water in relation to flooding and the like.
Yeah, I think from what I've heard from the council, they already have sort of strategic infrastructure network meetings with all these people. I don't know whether the council can confirm that.
Yes, thanks, Mark. We have had strategic infrastructure conversations with.
I'm getting some feedback on that.
Mr. Orves, can you turn off?
Yes, just to confirm, we have engaged with all infrastructure providers, so I don't accept the point about a lack of partnership approach there with infrastructure providers. What we're talking about into the future, where we are now, is the Strategic Infrastructure Forum, so infrastructure network, which will include a whole range of infrastructure providers, including the water companies. But I will obviously point out that on this particular plan, we do have a statement of common ground with Severn Trent Water, so it's fairly self-explanatory. We've engaged with them with that local plan process, just as a specific group. So.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll turn to the matter of viability now. Let me get this to the right page. So we've got questions 14 to 19. Just looking whether we try and conjoin some of these together. I'm just wondering about just taking it in the round viability this afternoon rather than going through each individual question, because I think, like lots of these things, there will be overlapping comments in relation to that, and that seems to have worked quite well this morning in terms of infrastructure. Has anybody got any objections to doing that, to discussing viability in the round, but obviously picking up the points that I've raised, and I'll pick up any questions at the end? No? Okay. So that's what we'll do. Council, do you want to make any opening comments on viability?
Just to summarise what we've done. Would it be useful if we just give a very quick summary of what we've done, and then obviously that can then sort of lead neatly into the questions. So Shropshire Council has obviously undertaken a viability assessment to specifically inform the proposals within the plan. That viability assessment looked at the policy requirements to have a financial implication, and directly informed our approach to affordable housing. Yeah, I mean, if you need more detail of the specific methodology, obviously we're very lucky to have Mr. Drummond-Hay here to provide further explanation. What I will say is one of the recommendations that resulted from that viability assessment was the sort of the recommendation to undertake further engagement with site promoters, particularly where they were in categories where the viability was more marginal, shall we say. And obviously that exercise is subsequently summarised within our viability topic paper, which we submitted. So if I just give you those two references in the first instance, we've got the viability study, which is EV115, and the viability topic paper, which is EV113. Would it be helpful if Mr. Drummond-Hay gave you a bit of an overview of the actual study itself now, or?
Yeah, that might be helpful. I've got all the studies open on my electronic screens, so if we need to turn to any of them, I can do. So, sorry, just remind me of your name again. Sorry, Mr.
Drummond-Hay.
He's on the edge of the line with the pink shirt on, madam.
Yes, I can see all of him apart from one arm.
We were first instructed by the council in 2010 when we did the SIL viability study, which led to SIL being adopted here as the second council to adopt SIL in the country. Since then, quite a lot has changed. The market's changed, and also the environment, the planning environment for doing viability studies has changed. But the approach taken is fully in line with the MPPF as updated and remains in line with the 2021 MPPF and the most recent the updated PPG and all the other changes. The reason for that is we've always been an advocate of the existing use value plus approach, and that is what has been embedded in the guidance more recently. As a firm, we're regulated by the RICS, so we have followed the RICS guidance. And the important factor, or I think the most important factor about that, is it requires us to be objective. So we're not trying to find the best possible answer for our client. We're trying to find the truth and to provide them with correct advice rather than what might be convenient. And we've also followed the Harman guidance, which is quite old, but is still valid guidance. And I think the important part of that is the requirement to consult. We were instructed at Christmas time in 2019, and we had a viability consultation in February 2020. Now, that was a relatively short consultation period. However, we were on a tight timetable then until COVID came and messed everything up. But 60 people attended a consultation event that was held here, and we had 30 written responses from a whole range of developers and housing associations. I think it's just useful to comment about the context when we were taking the comments from the consultation into the study. And it was when COVID was, no one knew what was happening. And if you looked at the predictions with regard to house prices and what have you, I think they ranged from a fall of 8% to a fall of 19% if you looked across the major consultancies. Actually, everyone has been hideously wrong, including us. And house prices have gone up about 28% since then. For some, we don't need to go into the reasons behind that, but to do housing supply and what have you. So the study is based on typologies. So we've modeled some sites to look like the type of development that's anticipated to come forward. And then we've assessed a handful of strategic sites which they were of sufficient size to be really vital to the delivery of the plan as a whole. We surveyed values and both housing and non-residential development. These were based on averages as per the PPG, and we drew heavily on the land registry data that is publicly available. We looked at costs as set out in Chapter 7, basing the costs on the BCIS median cost, which is very much in line with what is proposed by the planning practice guidance. And we adjusted for things like sites costs, normal costs. So on brownfield sites, we made an adjustment, fees, contingencies, and we made some standard allowances for Section 106 costs of £5,000 per unit on the typologies, being the best estimate of what is typically asked for by the council, in addition to SIP. We made an allowance for interest and sales cost, and we looked at the overall policy requirements as set out in Chapter 8 of the Viability Study. We used all that information to calculate the residual value for each site. The residual value is the maximum amount a developer can pay for a piece of land and still make an adequate return or profit. Now, it's quite important to just appreciate that we are not undertaking a commercial viability study here. We're not acting for a developer when they're making a proposal to their board or to the bank or what have you. We are carrying out a study strictly in line with the PPG. So with regard to developers' return, we're working within this band of 15 to 20% of costs, of value as being an adequate return. The outcome of the appraisals is the residual value. For a site to be viable, it needs to exceed the existing use value by an adequate margin, and that adequate margin is the existing use value plus, which is the benchmark land value. We used existing use values based on previously developed land and agricultural land, and then for smaller paddocks, we made an assumption as well of being more than agricultural land. For a site to be viable, on brownfield sites, the residual value had to be at least 20% above the existing use value, and on greenfield sites, it had to be £400,000 greater than the existing use value of about £25,000 a hectare. The council, when we embarked on this project, had 3 bands of affordable housing, 20%, 15% and 10%, and we suggested that the council needed to perhaps revisit some of the policies, and we refined those down to 2 policy areas of 20% and 10%. The 10% being in the north and the 20% being in the south. This is quite a difficult area from a viability point of view, and viability is tight, but one only has to look out and drive around the county, and it is quite clear that development is coming forward, and much of that development is fully policy compliant. So when we were making our recommendations, we not only looked at the outcome of the viability study, but we also considered what is happening on the ground. I suppose the largest question that I would take, both from your questions and the comments that have been made, is why didn't we update this study? And I thought I'd just quickly touch on that now. This study was concluded in July 2020. It went to committee in July 2021 for a decision whether or not to to submit the plan, and the plan was submitted in September 2021. So basically, the viability study was 15 months old, and one does have to draw a line in the evidence, and at that point, we had no doubt that the viability evidence was still up to date and appropriate. In the response to the question, we've set out some data about how house prices and build costs have changed since the viability study was undertaken. New build values have gone up by 28% based on land registry data, and the BCIS has increased by 8% based on BCIS data. Now, those figures are from a couple of months ago when we responded to your question, and there has been further inflation and build costs, and house prices have continued to go up. But there does come a point where you've got to take a view, and viability has moved in the right direction from a plan making point of view. So house prices have gone up more than build costs over that period. So if anything, the viability study now understates viability. I could go on talking about viability all afternoon, but if I paused then I could respond to any questions.
Thank you. Yeah, I've got a few questions, which some of them reflect comments of that I've read from statements, etc. So I'll run through some of those first, and then I'll take some questions. I'll open the floor up to participants. So something that came through from various developers. They argue that the benchmark land values are very low and would yield profits too low to incentivise developers to build. What do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, the benchmark land value, some people did raise concerns about that and suggested that a benchmark land value of at least £1 million per hectare would be appropriate. We do viability studies all over the country, and I can't think of anywhere, not even Windsor and Maidenhead, would we use a figure of that level. So, and if one did use, and we've done some viability, some sensitivity testing in the report on this, and if you used a figure of £1 million per hectare, nothing would be viable. And we know development is coming forward, so that cannot be the right figure. Now, there's £1 million a hectare and £1 million a hectare. And what is that £1 million a hectare actually referring to? When the big consultancies put out their research on what have you, when they're referring to land values, what are they actually referring to? Well, often they're referring to the net developable area. We're looking at the gross area. So a site that's 50% developed, our benchmark land value of 400 and something thousand pounds is 800 and something thousand pounds on a net developable area. My maths isn't good enough to do it on the difference, but you.
No, I understand the point you're making.
You get the point that we make. When you look at the price paid historically for bits of land, it's very difficult from the land registry to get those for the larger parcels of land, but for the smaller parcels of land, it is about £700,000, £750,000 per hectare historically. The planning practice guidance says this benchmark land value needs to be set at a level to allow policy compliance. So it is a balance, and it is about the return for a reasonable landowner. And the context of viability testing is about maximising the public benefit from the granting of planning permission. So a figure of, if we're taking an existing use value of £25,000 per hectare, we're looking at a benchmark land value that is 15 or 20 times the existing use value, which is a very substantial uplift.
Thank you. there's the next two questions I'll join together for ease, really. Firstly, did the viability assessment provision, assess the provision of specialist housing, things like older persons accommodation? That's been talked about quite a lot in the last week and a half. And also account of healthcare provision now being sought, because I think that's sort of moved on throughout the plan making process in terms of what's required in terms of healthcare.
So on the specialist housing, this study was carried out just after the planning practice guidance was updated, and under paragraph 10.007 of the Viability chapter of the PPG, it specifically says that that limits when viability testing should be carried out at the development management stage, and it gives a number of cases where it is appropriate to consider viability testing at the development management stage, and it says where the particular types of development are proposed which may significantly vary from standard models of development for sale, open brackets, for example, housing for older people. So the council isn't actually allocating sites of this type. So it would be, it's anticipated within the PPG that the viability testing would be done at the development management stage. The healthcare provision would be, met through a Section 106 payment. And in a study of this type, we can't look at each typology and make an estimate of what the allowance should be. We've made this allowance of £5,000 per unit, and within the appraisals, we have embedded SIL as a base cost. So there are the two levels of developer contributions to meet that. But
yeah, I think Mr. Drummond Hayes very eloquently explained that. But what I would just say is that is specifically reflected within our approach to infrastructure contributions in policy DP25.
Okay, thank you. I'm just moving down my questions. We've already answered some of them. So, so the saved sites, so the SAMDEV sites, they've not been assessed, as I understand it, under this viability assessment because they're not part of this plan per se, they're part of the previous plan. In terms of the asks of this plan, are they significantly different to the currently adopted plan? So for example, when the shift occurs from the plan that you've got now to this plan, when this plan's adopted, would the costs of 106, etc., be greater and therefore affect viability? Does that make sense?
I think that's a good question. I mean, the first point we'd make is, of course, the progress on the SAMDEV sites is an important consideration. Obviously, we've discussed that previously in terms of the amount of sites that have come forward. So quite a large proportion of those sites are subject to planning permissions. And I think I'm sure we've discussed it earlier in the week. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I'm not
sometime
sure
last week.
Now. Sometime. Obviously, we've given you figures in terms of how many have planning permission and being developed, and that is the lion's share of them. In terms of affordable housing contributions, I think Mr. Drummond Hay explained that in the current approach, we have sort of 10% zone, 15% zone, and 20% zone. Unfortunately, to complicate matters, it's not north, central, south, or anything like that. There's sort of pepper potting of the different zones throughout Shropshire. There is a map on our website. I think the new proposed approach is more straightforward, if you like, in terms of the division between the different zones. Generally speaking, I think obviously the new methodology is very much, well, the new proposed affordable housing rates are specifically informed by the viability testing, so they recognise the current viability situation. So we consider that effectively is recognised within that, and there isn't, in most instances, a significant shift in terms of the contributions.
I think I could add one more thing, and that's to do with the way we undertook the bulk of the study. It's based on typologies, and the typologies were drawn by looking at the sites in the Shropshire and the planned development. And Shropshire, the type of sites that come forward within the county are relatively similar. They're greenfield sites of different sizes, and one can draw parallels between the old sites and the new sites.
Thank you. We haven't got to the development management policies yet, but from memory of flicking through them, there is a mechanism, if you like, to consider viability as part of those policies.
Exactly. So, particularly with regards to obviously the affordable housing contribution and the energy efficiency contributions, I think there's a mechanism in both policies, as you referenced.
So, that residual amount that's left in the SAMDEV plan, that it might not prevent them coming forward. It might be just that some negotiations take place if necessary.
Exactly. So that is exactly how those policies are envisaged to operate.
So some of the developers are arguing for 10% in the south as well as the north. I think you've maybe touched on that the work you've done on that. I don't know whether you want to comment more on that.
Yes, well, the advice we gave was that some types of site in the south are more challenging from a viability point of view. A local plan needs to include affordable housing for it to be a sound plan. The reason for not going for 10%, clearly, quite a lot of the typologies are able to bear the 20%. Quite a lot of sites, or most sites, are delivering 20% in the south. But on the larger sites, we did suggest some caution that because they are to deliver a proportion of the housing requirement, the council should work with developers and make sure that they are deliverable. And that was at a stage where there were choices of sites which could be taken forward, and those sites with the positive feedback are the ones that have been included.
Thank you. That makes sense. Yeah. So the IDP post dates the viability assessment by round about 2 years. I don't know the exact that figure, but has that had will that have a bearing on the viability assessment? So there's probably more finely tuned figures now available for some of the larger infrastructure projects that would need funding.
Yes, so these IDPs are always quite challenging for us viability consultants, because we get given one and everything changes, we get given another one which is all up to date, and then they change the week before the hearings, and then they change again the day before the planning application is submitted. The figures we did, I have spoken to the council about these figures. They are broadly up to date, and they are appropriate. We did undertake some sensitivity testing around them. All these greenfield sites, all these strategic sites are challenging, like any large development site. The idea that any of them are easily deliverable, even in the highest value areas of England or Wales, it is really misunderstanding the whole development process. All these sites are tricky, which was why the council have continued to engage with the site promoters. And even the most challenging sites, such as the power station, which I rather dread mentioning, but that's about as challenging as development sites get. It is appropriate to consider to include sites like that because there is a way forward to deliver them and for them to bear, if not all, most of the infrastructure that they're required to deliver. I think it is worth noting that when we were first talking about the costs and the cost to be implied, we did, with the council, have a discussion about what is required and what is lovely and what everyone hopes to get, and to make sure the costs that were included were the costs that were necessary to make it acceptable in planning terms, because the figures can escalate otherwise. But the whole process has been a set of cautious assumptions, with costs probably being higher than they would actually be, and values being a very cautious approach to values, particularly bearing in mind when that part of the work was undertaken.
Thank you. And I think there was mention of Iron Bridge this morning, wasn't there? That's actually coming forward in terms of a planning application and things. So yeah, that's helpful to link those two together. I think there's just one more question before I see if anybody else wants to raise anything. There's been mention that the SIL will be reviewed, and it's in need of reviewing. Do you know when that's likely to take place?
Shall I field that question? I think the first thing to emphasise is the fact that the viability study that was undertaken by Mr. Drummond-Hay specifically included the SIL at its current rate, albeit there has been indexation since then. Although I'm reliably informed that actually the indexation has resulted in the SIL rate actually reducing slightly, because of the way that it's calculated over the last 2 years. It's reduced overall. One of the recommendations was to continue to review SIL, and that is something the council would undertake in any event. We've been carefully looking at the SIL, and I think we have to recognise the wider picture though, and obviously at this very moment in time, government's position is that they are intending to introduce a new form of infrastructure levy, and Shropshire Council is very alive to that. And I think our view at this point in time is that given that wider context, it would be inappropriate to review SIL at this point, because in all likelihood we will have a new form of infrastructure levy in the future, and we don't want to be in a position where we're undertaking abortive work. I mean, we have to think about efficient use of resources, and also taxpayer. We don't want to waste taxpayers' money, if you like, undertaking work that, as I say, would be superseded, if you like. So we will continue to monitor that situation, but our current view is that, given the wider context, it wouldn't be appropriate to review the SIL charging schedule at this stage in the process.
Can I just
thank you?
To really just reiterate, really, obviously we're aware there's obviously a number of changes potentially at the national level around the planning picture, and as has been explained, we fully recognise the SIL, as already been mentioned, we're the second authority in the country on adopting it, and so it is 9 years. Oh, I'm getting to nod, 9 years old. But I will say that has gone up every year with indexation as well. So oh, you already said that. You said that. Yeah, it's already been said. I will be quiet.
The one other thing I would just add is just an observation, is that perhaps as with a number of issues that are before you, my understanding is there's some parties that are suggesting the SIL rate should go up, and other parties suggesting the rate should go. So perhaps that's inevitable. But as I say, our view is at the moment we monitor it carefully, but given the wider context, we think we're in the right place, if you like.
Thank you. So I'll open up the floor to participants. Like this morning, if you can address all comments in terms of viability, which I think is fairly easy to do in one round, and then we'll move on to the next person, and we won't be coming back to individual people. So Mr. Orves, if I can start with you.
Thank you, Madam Inspector. Just 2 quick points, if I may. So the gentleman earlier mentioned about Iron Bridge, which is very pertinent. We mentioned earlier that the residents in the locale already have infrastructure issues with fresh water, having to have bowsers and bottled water on occasions because of the demand in other areas in the locale, preventing the water pressure. Similarly, the runoff of flood water, etc. So when the viability study was done, some of those issues were not really well understood. And I go back to the earlier point, which is unless you can quantify and cost the infrastructure, how can it be deemed to be viable? And to at the point that the councillors didn't quite answer in the previous session was that they put Much Wenlock and Iron Bridge at the forefront of the development in the short term. So there is no time to actually address the infrastructure shortfalls that we currently have before the building would start. So I'd be interested, Inspector, as to what the council believe, how they can mitigate not a risk but an issue. Yeah, because effectively it's a financial risk to the ratepayers of the whole county, and it's a material, substantial risk in terms of property damage, health, etc., for the people who live in the locale today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Orks. So that's quite a specific question. I'll just ask the council to come back on it. It obviously overlaps with some other things we've probably already talked about, but
yeah, thank you, Mrs. Crosby. I think with regard to water supply and strategic water, I'm preempting myself. I think we've previously discussed the fact that the local plan has been informed by a water cycle study, which included specific engagement with the water companies, including Severn Trent Water. We've now got, as previously referenced, a statement of common ground with the water companies. We are of the view that we have the confidence that the infrastructure necessary to support our development proposals are deliverable, and that is supported by that statement of common ground with the water companies. In terms of flood risk, our site assessment process was directly informed by a strategic flood risk assessment, and our site proposals are directly informed by our understanding of flood risk in the area. In the context of Much Wenlock, obviously without wanting to go into too much detail on a specific site, I think we've already referenced previously the fact that